Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show, by any host, or by any guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before you begin any new diet, exercise, or training program. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Welcome to Healing Ties on the Whole Care Network. On Healing Ties, we're creating a life to love after caregiving ends by sharing stories and resources and being with awesome people like you. Now that caregiving has ended, let the Healing Ties begin. Here's your host, Chris McClellan, the Bow Tie Guy.
Well, greetings, everyone. It is Chris McClellan, the Bow Tie Guy, for another episode of Healing Ties. Thanks for joining us today. Certainly want to send a hello and a shout out to all our listeners in the UK on ukhealthradio.com. Thank you for your continued support of the show, and thank you for all your great suggestions about different topics that you'd like to hear on Healing Ties. You know, Healing Ties is a part of the Whole Care Network, and on the Whole Care Network, we are all about story sharing. We believe on the Whole Care Network, it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to combat a common cause. And on today's podcast, do I have somebody that is proficient at story sharing and storytelling. Jay Newton Small is from MemoryWell, which is a digital platform for elder storytelling. Their network of more than 500 professional writers works with families, senior living communities, and home care providers to replace burdensome intake questionnaires with brief, intimate stories. MemoryWell portraits builds empathy with a poignant keepsake for families. And Jay, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You know, we met a few weeks ago in St. Petersburg, and I had the pleasure of watching and listening to your fabulous presentation on MemoryWell. But could you tell our listeners, first of all, a little bit about your background and MemoryWell? And I can't wait to talk to you about story sharing. This is exciting for me.
Well, Chris, I'm a longtime journalist. My background is actually almost exclusively in journalism. And after I graduated college, I went to journalism school at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And then I went to work in D.C. At Bloomberg. I was their White House correspondent from 2003 to 2007. And then in 2007, I went to Time Magazine, and I spent basically a decade at Time as one of their national correspondents, covering everything from the Obama-Hillary Democratic side of the campaign in 2007, 2008 to the Obama presidency to Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. And I've also done some time in the Middle East. I was London interim bureau chief for a few months, subbing in for the bureau chief who went on book leave, and I covered from there the collapse of the euro and the Arab Spring in North Africa, did a cover story in Egypt, also spent some time along the borders of Syria, covering that conflict, and in Iraq, covering ISIS, and then back and forth between the United States and the Middle East, and then came back full-time to the U.S. in 2013, and ended up writing a story that would lead to a book, which I wrote in 2014, and it came out, 2014-2015, and it came out in early January of 2016, called Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way America Works, which basically just looks at critical mass and what happens when women reach a tipping point somewhere between 20 and 30% in any institution, whether it's a legislature like the Senate or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court, and how it's a tipping point and they really begin to change the culture of that institution. And I've been lucky that the book was really well timed. You know, not only did I have one of the only interview that Hillary Clinton did in print in the first 9 months of her campaign, but we also, I was lucky to have a lot of great access with Kellyanne Conway on the Trump side, and then also I looked at Hollywood, for example, and critical mass, the end of the casting couch culture. And so since that came out in 2016, it's been great it's been an amazing ride. On the other side of it, on the much more personal side, I'm an only child, and my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was still a senior in college. And my mother took care of him for the first 10 years of his diagnosis, but then she actually ended up passing, dying of a stress-induced brain aneurysm in 2011. So,
oh goodness!
And that, I think, is a very common story for caregivers.
Yes.
People who, the stress just grew too great with his constant shadowing and proved to be too much for her. And I think one of my biggest regrets is not seeing earlier the huge amount of stress that she was under and how it affected her. So in 2011, I became my father's primary caregiver. I tried to keep him with me for a while, and that ended up being disastrous on a lot of levels. He, would think I was my mother and would try to make out with me. He would he would propose a lot, which was very sweet. I mean, it's clear that they had a great relationship, but it's also a little disturbing. and he also didn't, he wasn't familiar with my house in DC. I moved him up from Florida to Washington, D.C., and he was very, he would try to cook on the stove, and he was used to an electric stove, and I would come home to like a house full of gas, and
yes.
So stuff like that. And so it became pretty clear that I wouldn't be able to take care of him on my own. Even with home help, it just wasn't really possible, and I felt like I was locking him in the house all day long by himself with like an aide who really wasn't interested in engaging with him. So I finally put him into a community, and when I did, they asked me to fill out this enormous 20-page questionnaire. And
yes, I could just see the 20-page questionnaire too. Goodness.
And so, and I was sitting there struggling to write down the answers, thinking, I was a professional writer at the time, and I challenge anybody to describe successfully their parents' 50-plus year marriage in 4 lines. And then B, who was ever going to read and remember 20 pages of handwritten data points for the sort of more than 100 residents in that particular community? Nobody, right? And so instead I wrote down his story, and 1 page printed out, and I double-sided, handed out to all of the staff there. And I was like, this is my dad. And because he really couldn't tell his own story anymore. And they loved it. They remembered it. They told each other about it. 2 of his caregivers were Ethiopian, and they had no idea that he'd actually lived in Ethiopia for 4 years early on in his career with the United Nations. And
oh, goodness.
They became his champions. They would sit for hours and ask him what it was like, what Emperor Haile Selassie was like and what the Empress was like. And Dad loved it because he remembered Africa pretty well from his early 20s, even if he didn't often remember last week. And so MemoryWell grew out of that experience.
Oh, goodness. I knew a little bit about the background from your presentation in St. Petersburg, but you really dived right into it. And it just really proves the point as it relates to caregiving. Is we all have a story, and we connect to these stories without even knowing each other. We have this innate ability to understand where we've been and where we're going. And to hear the story again about your mom passing, it just happens all too often where the caregiver is the one that predeceases the caree, and it's just so hard to hear these types of stories because it could be avoidable if we were just able to talk a little bit more openly about it.
Absolutely.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask you, Jay, was when you took your father to the assisted living community. Of course, you're sitting there with all the paperwork and trying to fill that out. After creating the document and having the caregivers connect to your dad, that really had to bring a sense of security and safety to you, knowing that your dad was going to be safe.
Yeah, I think that we'd had a few episodes where he'd wandered off walking my dog, and he'd walked the dog 1,000 times at my house before, and then one day he just didn't remember, and so sort of panicked 4 or 5 hours later. Police found him a few miles away, and I think that the sense that I just couldn't be there 24/7 to be a safety net for him. And my mother had really been his anchor. And I didn't have the ability to sort of be with him all the time the way she was. And I think that it was also unhealthy. Like I wasn't, my mom, and they had obviously a much more intimate relationship than I had with him. And so that was the other sort of awkward thing, is that I look a lot like her. And so
okay.
and he was used to sort of sleeping with her, and the only time that they ever slept apart was when she was mad at him. And so he used to get really agitated at night because he would say, what have I done wrong? And he used to think that I was punishing him by making him sleep in the other room. And all night long he'd be trying to get into bed with me. And I'm like, and at first I was sort of like, what's harm can it be if he sleeps in, and then I would sort of wake up and he'd be like spooning me, and I'd be like, okay, well, maybe not. And so yeah, it just wasn't really feasible. And I think it was a really hard moment. I would have to say that I thought when my mother passed that was the hardest day of my life. And it would actually, the hardest day of my life was when I put my dad into assisted living. And he was the day before he'd been totally fine. He knew he was going to go in, and he was like sort of a little bit more there, I guess, and was sort of said, okay, I understand we need to do this. But the day of, when I dropped him off in the morning, he just totally flipped out and was just screaming at me that I was imprisoning him. And and I think it was so hard to watch him just be so unhappy. And he was saying, just yelling like, I can live alone. And I was like, Dad, you don't even know my name. Like, you can't, like, he didn't know my name in a couple of years. Like, you can't live alone. I think it was just really wrenching emotionally. And I think it's, you see that occasionally. I think they try to do it in better ways. And it's really obviously not the best way to do it, but sometimes it just happens that way. And it's hard. And like, those are, I think, really tough, not only on me, but also on the staff of that community, because he's just so upset and so unhappy.
And it's a transition for two people. It was a transition for you, and it was a transition for your father as well. And oftentimes we don't talk about how those transitions really impact us, because while you can plan for that day until the cows come home, but when that day happens, you just really don't know what it's going to be like. That's why it's so important to be able to share these stories, so that people that we come in contact that can relate to what is going on in their life with their caregiving situation. Hopefully it makes it just a tad bit easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, then certainly I felt the importance of speaking openly about my story and being really sort of in ways in which I think as a journalist, you never want it to be about you, the story, and you never really want to talk about your personal experiences. But I felt pretty strongly about sharing these particular personal experiences because after every time I talk about it, people come to me in the audience and say, I had the same experience with my dad or my mom or my husband or whomever it is. And so many people, I think it's sort of, I see it as almost this silent epidemic where it's just this unquestioned thing. We have to take care of our loved ones. And it's obviously, we do it and, like in my mother's case, sometimes to our own detriment. It's all of these sort of millions of caregivers across America who I think their colleagues and their friends and their people around them don't realize that they're living this kind of double life where, they have this huge burden on them that is just, it's sometimes overwhelming and enormous. They often don't talk about it because they don't want to embarrass their loved one. They don't want to, they don't want their loved one to be perceived as a burden. But it's important that we talk about those burden, the burden of caregiving. It is a burden, but it is also a labor of love. And it's something that I would do in a heartbeat for my father. If he were still alive, I would still be doing it, and I would continue to do it as long as I possibly could, because he was a wonderful father to me and I loved him enormously. And of course I was going to do my best to take care of him. I need to be frank about the emotional and mental toll that took. And as he got worse and he became incredibly violent towards the end of his life, which I think was also very difficult. And so these are things that I think unless we can speak openly about them as a society, we're never going to fully understand the cost of them.
Oh, goodness, we connect 100%. I do believe that there's no greater honor than to care for another person, especially the time when life transitions. But it is hard, and we often don't talk about it. What's amazing, I'd be interested from your perspective as a caregiver and a journalist. And we think that there's estimates of over 44 million family caregivers in the United States today, yet when we're thrust into the middle of it, most of the time we're not prepared. Nobody has caregiving on their bucket list of things to do in life. When we're in the middle of it, we think that we're the only ones, and we are afraid to reach out for help. And it's that dichotomy of caregiving where it's so prevalent in society, yet when you're when you're first starting out in it, you think you're the only one involved.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I feel really strongly about is that my mother, she was Chinese Malay. I think she was very Asian about her approach to this, and she hid my father's illness from all of their friends. She didn't want anyone to know. She was very ashamed of it, and I think that not only hiding it was, I think, terrible for both of them because it made him feel ashamed of it as well, but I think it also really hastened her own sort of decline, and because she was never open about this burden. She could never talk to anybody about it except for me, and I wasn't living there. I wasn't in Florida with them. I think it really did her enormous amounts of damage, and I wish, if the one thing I could do for her and after her death, to make her death meaningful, is to speak openly about this, to encourage other people to speak openly about their caregiving burdens, then maybe I can help save somebody's life like my mother's, who might be a little bit more willing to speak about their burden and ask for help, because you shouldn't be ashamed of this. This is something that is a very natural, normal part of life, and there are a lot of resources out there to help you.
It really is cathartic when you can talk openly and share your stories, and with the work that you're doing at MemoryWell, you're really putting this at the forefront of why it's important to share a story, or to share a caregiver's story, to share the caree's story, so that we all have a sense of understanding, because we can all connect through stories, and it really makes the world smaller in a sense, because we have more in common than we often think we do, especially after hearing somebody else's story.
Absolutely. And I think building those bonds. One of the things I love about MemoryWell, we now have a network of more than 600 writers across the country, and we work with continuing care, retirement communities, and assisted living facilities to write the life stories of seniors like my dad entering care. And some of them have Alzheimer's dementia, some of them don't. It's just sort of, it's more broad than that. One of the things I really love the communities do is they'll put the stories up in a corridor and on a board somewhere, and so that other families coming in can read them. And I think that that's really wonderful, because one of the really powerful impacts that I've seen in the stories is that the families begin to connect with one another. And I think that a lot of these places are very isolating. There's not really an easy way to get to know other residents and other people, and being able to see, somebody else's story and then see them in the corridor and say, oh, you went to the same college as my nephew's going to right now. Or you begin to sort of really relate to each other, and honestly, you start to lean on each other. And so I know that when MemoryWell first started, it was just my dad's story. And then I got really curious about the other people around him. And so we would start to write the stories of my dad's friends, and I would get my writer friends to tell those stories. And it was really nice, because I would, learn about these other residents, and therefore, if, Catherine's nephew couldn't make it that week, he would sort of text me and say, I'm not going to be there. And I'd be like, it's okay, I'll bring Catherine an extra cupcake. I know she loves cupcakes. And therefore, he knew that I was interacting with Catherine, and I was there with her and my dad, taking care of her, and making sure she was engaged, making sure she had what she needed. And likewise, I knew when he visited that, Catherine, that he would also engage with my dad. And I think that adds another level, another net that kind of helps you move forward, because you're all going through this together.
Oh, very much so. And I love it. You anticipated a couple of my next questions. So by sharing these stories, especially within the communities, that would have such a positive impact on people getting to know each other, and having a positive impact on relationships. Because when you're living in a community, there's people are coming from different backgrounds, but when you can connect through the stories and that person just a little bit better. Tell me a little bit about the process of MemoryWell as you go into a community. I imagine you couldn't really take everybody's story, but you probably would want to. But how do you find the stories in the communities? What's the process? So
we go into a community. We found the best way to do it is to actually have a family night. And we will send writers to that family night and ask them to, and basically whatever families that show up, we work really closely with the staff to identify good prospective families, to get the word out about us and what we do. And then once the families, come, we will have the writers on the spot, sort of split up with the families and interview them with hopefully the residents as well. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. Most of our interviews last half an hour, 45 minutes. They're usually relatively brief. Families love the process. They really enjoy being able to just sort of sit around and talk about their loved one and the good old days and think about like things that they probably have oftentimes they hadn't thought about in a very long time because they're so focused on the day-to-day caregiving piece of it. It's actually a really great process they really enjoy. And they usually will, whatever photos they have there at the time, will, get copies of those photos, and then we'll write the story after that. So the journalist usually can turn the story around in under a week. Usually it's a few days, then there's an edit involved, and then we'll send it back to the family for approval before we post it, before we publish it, so that they can say, yes, we want to include this, or no, we don't. But we also basically allow the families to determine whether they'd like to have their stories public or private. Okay. We encourage them to actually keep it private, and then basically whomever they pick to interact with the stories, they can give access to. But generally speaking, the vast majority of our stories are private. But some families don't like passwords, don't want to deal with it. It's a hassle.
Right.
They just say, you know what, I don't mind, and they make their loved one's story public. Once the story is written, we have it posted. The care staff has access to the stories. Mm-hmm. Like my dad's stories, they're all relatively brief. They're sort of 1 to 2 pages maximum, so you can print them out, put them in care plans, laminate them, put them up on walls. And then we also offer a timeline aspect to this. And so many families came to us after the stories had been written and said, we really love the stories, but we want to add to them. And, we send them around to extended family and friends, and Uncle Joe one step at a time when they went ice fishing in Michigan and whatever hilarity ensued. And so they really wanted to have them more interactive. And so what we did is we created this timeline. And that way they can add in their loved one's favorite music and movies and arts and readings from all different eras. And that way whomever is sitting with them, whether it's a paid caregiver or a grandchild, they have a whole toolbox of things with which to engage that person. And that, is something it's very interactive. Families, we're starting to incorporate AI into it, where if you pick one particular song, then it might suggest other similar songs from that era. There's also all kinds of movies and suggestions, and then we'll send weekly engagement questions where we'll sort of say, hey, here's a photo of the moon landing. Why don't you talk about as a family, where were you during the moon landing? Where was this person, your grandfather? Were you all at home watching it on television? Were you at your uncle's place? Did the uncle remember the moon landing? Just getting different family stories like that and sort of having everybody collaborate. And I think especially for far-flung families, it feels really great to be able to involve people who are far away, who often feel that they're not, more involved in the caregiving.
And you had that experience as well while you're living in D.C. and with your mother caring for your father in Florida. You understand personally difficulties of long-distance caregiving, and having these stories really helps bring families together. But it also, it not only helps the community, but goodness, what a great keepsake for future generations.
Yeah, absolutely. We found that families love the stories because they are amazing keepsakes for other generations. And I think they also really love it. It really does help them interact with their loved ones. So we often hear, for example, there's one woman in Chicago whose grandchildren wrote to us and said, thank you so much for this. We used to visit her and she was really hard to engage, and they didn't know that much about her, and it was sort of boring to visit her because she would just sit there, and she didn't know them, and it was hard to interact with her. And they, once the story was written, her granddaughter realized that her grandmother loved fashion. She'd sewn most of her own clothing her entire life, and her granddaughter also really loved fashion, so she would start to bring Vogue every week, and she would sit and read Vogue with her grandmother, and the grandmother loved it because she would really love to look at the different fashions. She would bring old photos of the outfits her grandmother had sewn, and it made visiting her really fun for the granddaughter. So just being able to educate, I think, future generations about things that families often don't realize, that my kids don't know that much about my parents. It's just, it, but you don't realize how little they know and how hard it can be for them to interact.
Goodness, you're just doing terrific work, and to come full circle, the work that you're doing is just connected to your own personal caregiving story, and that has to feel good.
It's really powerful work, and I definitely feel like a great way of applying my craft, my journalism, my writing in a totally different, unique way, and telling the senior stories and telling those stories that would otherwise be lost. And I find that really, really powerful and meaningful.
I could talk to you all afternoon because I just love the concept of story sharing, but we just have a couple of minutes left in today's podcast. Can you let our listeners know how they can find you, find MemoryWell, and contact you for your services?
Sure. So we're really easy to find. We're just at MemoryWell.com, which is MEMORYWELL, all one word.com. So MemoryWell.com. Not only do we have obviously the services that we offer, but we're launching in the next couple of weeks a whole sort of news site on caregiving, which we hope to be a resource for caregivers. More than half of our writers are caregivers themselves and wanted to write about the experience. And we found that there was a real need for it, for more resources. And so we're super excited to be able to launch this news website where we can be a resource to caregivers and really provide them with sort of a series of how-to-dos, like how to navigate, signing up for Medicare and Medicaid, how to navigate picking assisted living, how to figure out behavioral issues in certain areas. And so that's really, we're super excited about that. Then the other way to sort of, if you want to find us or contact us, you can also call us. We're at 202-854-WELL, W-E-L-L, which is 9355. So that's 202-854-9355. And I'm really easily reached at just J-A-Y at MemoryWell.com.
Well, I think MemoryWell should have a podcast on the Whole Care Network.
That would be really fun. We should definitely talk about it.
I'd like to invite you to have a podcast on the network. That'd be terrific. But we can certainly have that conversation offline. But Jay, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to visit with me, and certainly the work that you're doing at MemoryWell. You're certainly someone who's creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for joining me today. Thank you.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for what you're doing, and you're such an important resource. So thanks again for all that you do with this podcast and everything else.
What a delight to have Jay on the program this morning. Goodness, I know firsthand how healthy it is, at least for me, to be able to share my caregiving story, and I hope you find the avenue to share your caregiving story. Well, that does it for this episode of Healing Ties. As you know, I'm the Bowtie Guy, Chris McClellan. I'm creating a life to love after caregiving ends through radio, writing, travel, advocacy, and being with awesome people like Jay Newton Small. Healing Ties is a part of the Whole Care Network. Check us out online at thewholecarenetwork.com. We'll see you for another episode of Healing Ties real soon. Bye-bye.